Thank you, Pat. Our next speaker is Ken Stansell, who is the Deputy Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I had a great conversation with Ken at lunch, and I think one of the things that I am looking forward to hearing from him is that when we say U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service anymore, everybody immediately starts thinking about the Endangered Species Act. And a lot of times they stop there and stop short of realizing that that's one part of what this agency does, and it's certainly not perhaps the most important. So please help welcome Ken Stansell.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and we really appreciate the opportunity to participate. And the comments are right. If anyone has been listening to the news lately, everybody wants to know, what are we going to do about polar bears? Whether or not we're going to list the polar bear as an endangered species, and how does climate change affect what we're doing as it relates to endangered species. You hear an awful lot about that. And those are important issues, and I'll talk a good bit about climate change because I think that is probably going to be the paradigm shift that we're all going to have to face at some point, and probably sooner than later. But just to remind everyone, the Fish and Wildlife Service manages 95 million acres through our National Wildlife Refuge System. We've got at least one refuge in every state, and about 548 now, I think, individual units. We operate 69 national fish hatcheries and 64 fisheries resource offices throughout the country. We've got 81 ecological services offices, and we do a wide variety of activities within the service. One of the ones that I hope you're very familiar with is our Partners program, where we've developed a voluntary cooperative habitat conservation program that we believe really is going to be the future of the way we're going to do business. We manage migratory waterfowl hunting and migratory birds throughout the country. We're working in cooperation with the states, set the seasons every year for migratory bird hunting. I mentioned our fisheries research programs. We have a tremendous program in fisheries conservation and restoration and mitigation. A lot of other things, environmental compliance, trying to deal with the issues of energy conservation and how you do that in a method that is at least recognizes fish and wildlife values. Just wanted you to know, as we're taking questions and as we're talking today too, that we do touch the landscape, we the Fish and Wildlife Service, in many different ways and many different opportunities to work together for wildlife conservation. Just so you know, I've been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 30 years. My degrees are in wildlife biology, and I just had recently, about 2 years ago, the proud fortune, I think, to be named as the Deputy Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I sit at the top of the heap, and from that experience to me has really brought home the impact that the Fish and Wildlife Service does have, but more importantly, that the extended impact that we could have in working cooperatively for wildlife conservation wherever it occurs. We do believe, though, that we're rapidly moving away from a world in which land and wildlife habitat can be managed within one of our refuge borders or within a fence line. Change is driving the way we do business on the landscape, as well as within our organization, and I think many of the organizations represented here today. I don't want to repeat a lot of things that have been said today, but I do want to focus on at least two areas where I think it is most important that we begin redoubling our efforts to address issues that specifically relate to wildlife conservation. Climate change and invasive species. We've heard just before me issues concerning water quality and quantity. We are experiencing a tremendous drought now in the southeast. We're now deciding whether Atlanta will have drinking water or will have 12 species of bivalves that may not survive if we reduce the water flowing out of Lake Lanier. It's just a reality that we've come to face. Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, Okefenokee Swamp we call it, 400,000 acres burned this past summer. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the changes that are going to be coming as a result of water quality and quantity. One that I think it's critical, and you've heard a lot today, is changing human demographics. As we look at continuing fragmentation of habitat, conversion of wildlife habitat to other uses at a fairly significant rate, a much faster rate than we have seen historically. But I think for the purposes of our discussion today, I really do want to concentrate on climate change, the effects of climate change, and invasive species on fish and wildlife habitats. These two things are really interrelated, and we believe will have a direct impact on what's probably the third key issue of change, and that's setting priorities within limited resources. We've talked about appropriators today. We've talked about resources available. Certainly over the last decade, the resources that the Congress are able to devote to wildlife conservation, to rangelands conservation, are not increasing, and at least in our instances are decreasing. So we're going to look at setting priorities over the next decade or so, and there's going to be some hard choices because we've got an awful lot to do. We're also looking at opportunities for partnerships, opportunities where perhaps we can bring our resources together with other resources to achieve a common goal, a common objective. Throughout the history of the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've dealt with drought and hurricanes and development, and all of you have, and we've come through the Dust Bowl. We have adapted. We've been able to deal with those things. But I think the reality is that the warming of the earth could potentially, at least, have more far-reaching impacts on wildlife and wildlife habitat than any challenge that we've had before us. It is likely, if not a necessity, that we'll have to generate new tools. We'll have to create new approaches to deal with the impact of climate change on wildlife and wildlife conservation. Those impacts, those changes are going to vary depending on where we are in the country. The issues that we're dealing with right now around the polar bear have to do with sea ice and the fact that the sea ice is melting. And depending on the rate of that melting and the availability of sea ice habitat for polar bears, we're trying to grapple with what their future looks like. That's going to be different in other parts of the country, which may see increases in precipitation. The coastal areas where you'll see changes in the coast as water rises. So it's going to change dramatically over time. It's going to be gradual in some instances. But I think it's important that we all realize that we need to figure out ways of adapting to those changes. We believe that we will see disruptions in biological patterns and interactions between species and their habitats. I think we're already seeing some migratory pattern shifts, subtle, but they're there. Our premise for all of the 95 million acres of habitat that we've bought and set aside has been that if you build it, they will come. If you've got that piece of ground and you can manage for it, then you can make it adaptable for wildlife. But if we bought a refuge for a particular species of migratory bird and that species decides it needs to migrate somewhere else, then we're going to have to figure out how best to utilize that land and how to adapt accordingly. I think we're going to see disappearances, changes, displacements of species that depend upon riparian habitats and wetlands. You know, I don't want to paint a picture of gloom and doom. I think what the Fish and Wildlife Service is very excited about is that we do need to understand that the way we've done business for the last 100 years in wildlife conservation and wildlife management is going to have to change for the next 100 years for us to be effective in addressing these challenges and maintaining the mission, at least, of our service. If you interrelate that then with invasive species, we're today facing some of the challenges with invasive species that we think are going to be extremely accelerated as we deal with climate change over time. Changes in vegetation patterns, distribution of wildlife, reduced water flow, greater incidence and intensity of fires all come about to affect changes in habitats. On western lands, conservative estimates of aggregate weed spread range from 10 to 15% a year. Non-native invasive species crowd out native wildlife, damage valuable habitat, and they're right now are probably one of the #1 threats to our National Wildlife Refuge system. In 2006, the refuge system spent $9.6 million to try to eliminate or control invasive plants and animal populations. Approximately 2.3 million acres of refuge lands are currently impacted with invasive plants, and right now our best estimate is we have over 4,000 separate invasive animal populations. One of the biggest problems that we're facing right now, at least from the public, we don't think it's that big of a problem, is looking at the large constrictors that have been released in the wild in Florida. And they're looking for us to stop that somehow. You've got boa constrictors that are 9, 10, 12 feet long now, growing, thriving very nicely, if you will, in southern Florida. Recognizing the impact of invasive species on fish and wildlife habitats located on private lands is no less severe than on public lands, and we're trying to work as closely as we can with private landowners nationwide to help them try to restore fish and wildlife habitat by controlling invasives. So how are we responding to these issues? They have prompted the service to realize that perhaps for the first time, our vision can't be tied to the past. It's no longer good enough to simply continue what we're doing, continue what we've always done as an agency, as a group of wildlife professionals. So what can we do? What should we do? Just for your information, the Department of the Interior has created a climate change task force. It's now examining how possible climate changes would affect everything from disaster management, water resource management, and habitat management, and we're looking to develop new management responses to this changing landscape. The service has formed a climate change work group and is currently planning a series of regional forums to help collect information on effects of climate change, particularly in coastal areas, but really throughout the country. And I would encourage any of you to be in contact with our regional offices and participate in those regional workshops. The refuge system is now considering climate change, and we're looking at using we have a comprehensive conservation plan process, looking at climate change through that process, trying to get to provide a framework for guiding the refuge management decisions. We're engaging volunteers in the fight against invasive species, particularly on our refuges, and trying to expand citizen participation in refuge operations. One of the things that we've talked about a good bit today is getting more involved, getting the message out, and through our volunteer program on our refuges is one opportunity for us to do that. As I indicated earlier, we're actively working in partnership with private landowners to conserve and remove invasive species on private lands. Our partners for Fish and Wildlife in our coastal program, we were able to contribute $3.7 million in 2006 and $4.9 million in 2007. That's not much money, looking at the issues that are going to be before us. Talking about all of this means that we do have to manage within our budget, and we have to set priorities. We know that distribution function and the values of wildlife and habitat are changing and will continue to change, and it's best to adapt our efforts to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants in light of these anticipated changes. As I indicated, one of the things that probably won't change unless it's continuing to go down are budgets and funds available for these kinds of activities. And so we're looking for ways to focus efforts where they will do the most good. One of the things, particularly in response to climate change, that we're trying to move the agency toward, and again, it's kind of different than the way we typically do project by project management, and that's looking at a landscape level, looking at adaptive management frameworks that incorporate population goals where we identify certain species that we want to reach, and doing that at a landscape level as opposed to just on our refuge. 73%, I think, of all wildlife habitat is on private property. So trying to leverage those opportunities and work together in trying to deal with that. For us to achieve our conservation goals and live up to our trust responsibilities, working with landowners, volunteers, and other partners, that cooperative spirit is no longer a luxury. We believe that it is a necessity, and the service is moving forward in one area very rapidly, and that is to increase our cooperative efforts for wildlife conservation. Our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is, again, a voluntary program working on private property, but we've been able to leverage the non-service dollars by a rate of 4 to 1 in that program, so we can bring other resources together. Assistance from professional societies such as yours will play an essential role in providing the science-based information, and to go back to the previous speaker, in getting the word out, where we can get the most resource benefits from every dollar expended. You can help us develop predictive models to determine where the water will be, where invasive species might increase their range, and what type of food and energy crops will be grown and where, so that we can make the best decisions we can. We need your expertise and experience in examining information needs, whether new types of monitoring might strengthen our understanding of on-the-ground trends and vegetative patterns, movements of species, and other factors. We need to work together to share information and inform the public about the effects of climate change and invasive species on fish and wildlife resources. The previous speaker talked about whether the glass is half full or half empty. I think a lot of people think about climate change and the impact that it could have, and either are not quite there in wondering whether all the science is there to know what's going to happen, or look at it from a pessimistic viewpoint. Well, it's going to happen and there's nothing that we can do about it. Winston Churchill once said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." And for me, that makes me an optimist. For the service, that makes us an optimist. I don't believe that we can just ignore the facts, but I do believe that we can accept that, we can look for better information, and we can move forward for the next 100 years in managing our wildlife and our wildlife resources. I believe that the service and range managers have a lot of common ground. We are both caretakers of the greatest natural resources in the world. We share the same interest in healthy land, water, and wildlife, and we deal with many of the same issues. So I think we have a real opportunity to continue to work together. I think we've got a good past of working together, but there's going to be an awful lot more to be done. Through a shared vision and commitment to conserving our natural resources, we can help change the future for the better. Thank you very much.